Welcome to today's staatskantine. We're really delighted to have gotten so much interest for this session with Public Digital's Andrew Greenway today. Andrew, thanks so much for being with us. And my name is Danny. I'm the co-director and one of the co-founders of Staatslabor. I'm not here by myself today. I'm accompanied by many of my colleagues who are in the call with us. A radical part seems to have attracted a couple of people. At Staatslabor, we're all about the radical change, the kind that's needed, and that's why we're particularly delighted that you're here with us. Andrew, Andrew, you're a partner at Public Digital. This is a global consultancy established essentially by the heads behind the government digital service at the time in the UK, which was and still is, I suppose, sort of the pioneering digital service that a lot of countries have learned a lot from. You're an expert in digital government, though what's important for this audience also is you came through the civil service side rather than the tech side. So Andrew is someone who really deeply understands how bureaucracy and how government works, and also, of course, understands how technology works. And one of the basic theses of Staatslabor is we tend to have a lot of attention and interest on the what question, which is usually a political question. What's the policy? What are we about to do in government? And we don't tend to have a whole lot of attention on the how question. How are we actually going to do this? And that is, of course, exactly what your Radical How report was about. And I think particularly interesting for us in Switzerland is we do actually have extremely strong processes that make us think about the how, and often they're legally mandated consultation processes. The only trouble is that they all happen before we get going, before we do anything. And Andrew, I think you'll argue that may be fine and dandy, but we also need to think about how we do things as we go along. So with that, thanks so much for being with us. Andrew, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Danny. While I share my screen, I will just say very good afternoon to all of you. Really grateful to you sparing your lunch hour to come and listen to me. I have to say the sort of having the expectations in the chat before I start is a slightly intimidating brief. I mean, it's always quite tough for a speaker to be asked to come on and be inspirational. I will do my best. Danny's already kind of given me a very kind introduction, so I won't go into any more detail about myself, and we'll just kind of get to it. So I'm going to start with an opinion, which Danny's already alluded to, and I don't think this is an especially controversial opinion, but that the success of any government comes down to how it does things, at least as much as what it does. And that doesn't seem like a particularly controversial statement, but sort of as Danny mentioned at the start of this, it's actually a thing that governments and the kind of the discourse around government and politics tends to take a lot less attention to than the what of government. And it's quite important what I mean here about how it's not so much that we're doing a better job of some of the artifacts that government officials tend to work on. It's not like we're writing better documents or conducting more sophisticated economic modeling as it's actually adopting some quite different ways of working within the public sector in order to deliver much stronger and better outcomes. Bit of context, and you'll have to forgive me that this is a relatively UK-centric presentation, although I think a lot of the lessons in it apply more widely. So as you, I'm sure, are very well aware, the UK has just got a new government after 14 years, took power last month. And that government has inherited quite a tough legacy, it is fair to say, in many ways. We don't have a lot of money. Public services aren't a good place. I'm not going to go party political, but it's not a particularly rosy picture in the UK at the moment. But one of the things that's sort of quite important about the Labour government and how it's taken power and how it's set up and framed its kind of self coming into power is that it's taking a position of being a mission-driven government. And by mission driven, it's sort of taken in part some inspiration from a book written by an economist based in London called Mariana Mazzucato, who, and I'm sure a few of you will have come across this, a book called Mission Economy. And she sort of talks about the use of missions as a sort of an overarching framework for thinking about government, having big moonshot goals, the Apollo landing being the kind of the obvious big example, and using those big goals partly to provide political focus, but also to kind of help shape the wider market and the wider economy and ecosystem around achieving those big goals. And what's implicit in some of that is that will actually require government to work in quite a different way. So in the lead up to the Labour government taking power, Public Digital, myself, my colleague Tom Loosemore, were invited by an organisation called Nesta to write a report, which was essentially looking at, okay, if we're going to have a mission-driven government in this country, and that's intended to be quite a departure from how we tend to run things, what do we need to do to actually make that real? How do you make that tangible? What's the real difference in terms of how government goes about its business in order to deliver difficult, complex social outcomes? And what that prompted us to do was look at some examples over the last 20 years or so of where the government, particularly in the UK, but also beyond, had done big, complicated, cross-cutting, complex things, where it had done those things really well, and also where it had done those things really quite badly. And to see if we could tease out what was common about the things that had gone well, and equally what was common and sort of typical of some of the things that had gone less well. And I'd say most of the examples in the Radical How, for the few of you who've already read it, will have realised that it's quite UK centric, but actually the work that Public Digital has done with governments all over the world show that there is lots of other countries, America, Canada, Australia, Japan, I dare say Switzerland as well, where there's quite similar characteristics in what's gone well and what's gone less well. And one of the first things that we found, and a really kind of important conclusion to kind of bear in mind, is that we found that government can do these things really well. It can do very complicated, very complex, solving new and difficult problems incredibly effectively. And there were quite a few examples in the UK. One was the Vaccine Task Force, which is quite a small group of both public servants and people who come in from the outside who are charged with developing and securing a sufficient number of doses of the COVID vaccine. And this was all before there was any real kind of great optimism that such a thing would be even possible. And that was a team, as I say, in the government that achieved a globally substantial and significant outcome. But the thing that we found when we looked at examples of things like the Vaccine Task Force or setting up the London 2012 Olympics, those kind of big moments where the public sector really stepped up and delivered something pretty spectacular, was that in virtually all of those examples, the teams doing them were working against the grain. They weren't doing things the normal way that government was doing things. And they tended to be doing those things in quite exceptional circumstances, things that were unusual and different to kind of what had gone before. Often they were doing that in some form of crisis, where essentially the government had no choice but to kind of work in different ways because it knew that if it just kept on doing what it was doing in the normal way that it was doing it, it wasn't going to get there. So a few of you have kind of picked up on the word radical as one of the things that drew you into this talk. And the bad news is, the secret is, lots of this isn't really very radical. In that, governments have done it before, and they've done it lots of times and all around the world. The radical bit is not that. The radical bit is making those exceptional moments and exceptional teams and circumstances, making that normal, making that so that's the thing that happens all the time in government rather than just some of the time, despite what government does. So that's the challenge that we've really set ourselves. So sort of stepping back, like coming back to what was common, what was good about those kind of teams that delivered those exceptional things? What were the things that those teams and those initiatives had in common at their kind of core? And when we looked at those kind of projects that did exceptional work in all sorts of different policy contexts and different scenarios, things that they did in almost every case, they had these three qualities at the center of what they did. They had multidisciplinary, citizen-centered teams. They were incredibly focused on the outcomes and the real-world outcomes that they were trying to deliver. And they adopted a test and learn approach, how they kind of tried to solve their problem. They didn't try and work out all out up front at the start and then implement it. They were constantly testing and learning and iteratively improving what they were delivering. So those three things are really important. So it's worth us spending a bit more time unpacking each. So multidisciplinary citizen-centered teams, what does that mean? Well, as I'm sure all of you know extremely well as public servants, almost every government organisation has a tendency to separate itself out according to a series of tribes. So you have tribes by different profession. So you've got policy, you've got operational delivery, you've got technology and IT, you've got digital, economics, and so on. And you've also got the tribes of different departments. So you might have the welfare department or the internal affairs department or the finance department. And the kind of the identity of lots of public service servants will be bound up in one of those two things, possibly both. The teams that kind of actually delivered these kind of exceptionally difficult and impressive things didn't think of themselves in that way. They weren't separated by those typical silos of government. They brought together all the different disciplines they needed and brought them together in the same room. They brought the different departments together and they brought them together in the same room. Now, quite often what happens in government, certainly in the UK, is those meetings happen, but they happen at the level of senior management. They happen in the governance meetings. They don't happen enough at the level of the team. But in those really successful programs, that's what was going on. Citizen-centered is also kind of one of the things that's worth unpacking a little bit, because that sounds a bit like jargon. You hear kind of citizen-centered or user-centered quite a lot in the context of digital government. So at the really basic level, what do I mean by citizen-centered? What I mean is public servants actually talking to the people who are using public services, who their actual users are. And I mean that in the most direct sense. They're not necessarily hearing about them through consultation or some of those kind of more formal engagement processes. They don't go through intermediaries like trade bodies or industry groups. They actually talk to the people who are going to be affected by those services and get the feedback directly from them. They don't go through mediators. That sounds incredibly basic and glib, but actually that kind of connection between the reality of what the public experience of public services and the people who are charged with providing them, quite often there's a huge gap between those two things. And the final thing that's worth saying about those teams, those multidisciplinary citizen-centered teams, is that they were working with suppliers quite a lot of the time, but they were working in blended teams where you couldn't really tell who was a civil servant and who might be a contractor or consultant. They were all part of one same team, rather than what often happens, which is this sort of a sense of outsourcing where a bunch of civil servants will throw something over to a supplier to sort out and will kind of leave them to it. These teams were much more blended between those two worlds. That's teams. I also sort of said the second point that was kind of common to these really successful examples was they were incredibly focused on outcomes. So what do I mean by that? Well, I kind of mean that they were guided by a very clearly articulated political intent that was kind of grounded in the reality and humanity of public service delivery. So it's a bit like, rather than caring if you're an education team about the level of exam passes that they were getting, the outcome you're actually trying to achieve there is how are we creating a workforce that's appropriately educated for what the country needs? Like, what is that high level outcome on the ground that you're actually trying to achieve? And that kind of clarity of political intent coming from ministers was one of the qualities that these successful teams shared. So, for example, one of the kind of the big programs in the UK about 10 years ago was a program called Universal Credit. Universal credit was about providing a working age benefit to lots and lots of people, millions of people across the country based on certain characteristics. And the minister at the time said, I don't want you to deliver universal credit. That's not the outcome that I'm trying to achieve here. The outcome that I'm trying to achieve as the government is that I want more people to find more work while protecting those who haven't. And that is the outcome that the civil servants were directed to achieve. The minister didn't say, I want you to deliver a policy. I've got strong opinions about how you get to that outcome. That's the job for the public service to work out. But your North Star is that clarity of outcome. More people finding more work while protecting those who don't. And all of those successful teams had that very clearly articulated political intent. The teams then translated that kind of high level outcome into sort of meaningful, measurable outcomes. They managed to quantify it. They kind of gave themselves a set, a relatively small number of indicators that they could track and manage to give them the reassurance that they were moving in the right direction. And they were quite careful not to kind of to make sure that those things were focused on outcomes and outputs, not the inputs. Again, there's a sort of great government, and this is often a political tendency to announce those inputs. We're going to invest 100 million euros in X. And that's the announcement, and that's the exciting bit. Well, it's not really. The final thing around outcomes was one of the sort of things, the traps that they tended to avoid. So in the sort of 1990s and 2000s, there was a real tendency in the UK to set lots of targets. and kind of essentially guide the wider machine by saying that certain numbers must be hit. And targets were very effective at shaping behavior in big complex systems and across organizations, but not always in the ways that people wanted. Because civil servants and people are smart, right? So they will game the system. They'll manage to achieve the target, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily achieving the outcome that you're actually intending to reach. And then a third quality of those teams was this point around testing and learning. So the typical path of delivering a big complicated thing in government is that you'll set up a program. And that program will begin by some very clever people taking what the minister said and translating that into a long policy document, a set of rules, maybe a set of laws that kind of set out the framework for how we're going to deliver this thing. What will then usually happen is you'll sort of take that policy document and turn that into a list of requirements, things that a sort of system or set of services needs to be able to do. Those requirements will then get translated into a bunch of technical requirements, what the thing is you need to build. That thing will then get thrown to a bunch of suppliers who'll try and build it. That thing will then get thrown over to the actual frontline staff that have to run the service. And then finally, that thing might actually hit the public. And that linear process, that waterfall process of kind of big complex program delivery often takes years before the actual kind of results of all of that reach the public services, public servants. That kind of big bang launch kind of approach. And often that leads to disaster. We had several of those in the UK. And what Test and Learn was about going, well, actually, let's reject that. We're not going to kind of go through that long linear process where it takes years to go from idea to something that's actually received by the public. We're going to try something small. We're going to test it with a few people. We're going to learn from that experience. We're going to change it, improve it, and then we're going to test it again. And then we're going to test it again. And you kind of have that cycle, that feedback loop of learning as you scale. And the another important point about that was it wasn't just that they were testing what the technology was or what the website looked like. They were testing every element of that service. So they were changing the policy, they might be changing the financial and economic assumptions behind it, and they might be changing the services design. But they were changing all of those things as they learned, as they iterated, as they scaled the service. And through every point, they were thinking about what are the risky hypotheses that we're making about how this thing will work? How do we test those with real people as quickly as possible so we can learn whether that actually translates into reality? And it's worth spending a minute on why that kind of test and learn approach is so important, I think. And it's because so much of what you're trying to do in government is inherently complicated. It literally cannot be predicted. Human behavior is just not that reliable. As much as we would like it to be, humans do weird things quite a lot of the time. They can't be fully predicted. And not only that, the world changes very, very quickly around us. Technology is kind of often pointed to as this rapidly changing world, and it is. But lots of kind of social trends as well as technological trends are shaping the context in which public services are being delivered all the time. And yet the way that government tends to go about this by trying to define everything exhaustively up front basically ignores that. Basically say that's not true. We can work this out. If we're smart enough, we can figure this all out up front and then build it and it will be fine. And that is just not the case. It just cannot be done. And then that's not because people aren't smart. People are incredibly smart in government. And that's actually part of the problem. I think there's a tendency in the culture in some kind of public services and public organizations to try and kill complexity with cleverness. And that is just not possible. And yet a lot of the kind of processes around how government develops policy, how it funds big complicated things, even how it buys suppliers to help deliver them, that all is predicated on the idea that you can have almost perfect foresight. And the only thing that you can have perfect foresight on is that you can guarantee that in some way you'll be wrong. So that's why test and learn is about breaking that kind of cycle, acknowledging the fact that government is inherently complicated and inherently complex, and working with that in a way that kind of means that you're not storing up failure and problems for later. Now, the UK has not exactly a proud record of following the kind of the methodologies that I've talked about. And one of the sort of most notorious examples of where we kind of fell foul of thinking about things in that very linear waterfall style rather than test and learn was an enormous IT project that we had in the UK. This was about 12, 13 years ago now. where the National Health Service tried to build an IT system that would essentially run the health service, do all sorts of different things across an incredibly complicated federated organisation. The UK spent, I think, not far off a particle accelerator's worth amount of money on it, certainly a pretty huge amount of money. I think, to the best of my knowledge, it remains the biggest civilian IT disaster globally. Pretty spectacular. And yet, pretty much nothing was kind of yielded for the thick end of £11 billion. And it got so little for it because it tried to do what I described as the thing that the radical how is breaking out of. It tried to work out everything that the NHS could possibly need to do up front, and that simply wasn't doable. But it's interesting to contrast this with sort of examples from outside government, because what I'm saying here is that kind of the radical how and the methodologies that I'm talking about are not a way to stop failure. Absolutely, you can't kind of prevent failure. The difference is the kind of failure. So you look at Amazon, which applies a lot of the kind of the ways of working that I'm describing in the radical how, that idea of multidisciplinary teams, the idea of being focused on outcomes, that iterative test and learn approach. A lot of those qualities are sort of right at the core of the ways of working of lots of internet era companies, lots of the kind of the companies that are thriving in the digital economy. And yet they fail all the time. How come that they can fail all the time and yet still be these incredibly successful private sector organizations? And it essentially comes down to this. The likes of Amazon and others are applying those radical how ways of working, the ways of working of the internet era to delivering things at scale. They test lots and lots of bets. They try lots and lots of things. And crucially, because they're working on that quick cycle, if something's not working, they stop it. They don't have to wait to get to the end of the program where they put the public service in front of people 4 years after the policy was first created to work out whether it's working or not. They'll find that out within days or weeks whether a particular idea is working. And if it's not working, they stop it. In the UK, the National Health Service applied the government's usual ways of working to delivery at scale, and it did not know that things were definitely going to go wrong until it was too late. The failure was too big. And the problem with that often in government is that failure can run away with you. You kind of, I'm sure you've come across the idea of the sunk cost fallacy. As the costs grow, it gets more and more painful to stop the thing. People just go, but it might be okay. Let's just give it another year and another few hundred million, and we'll probably pull ourselves out of this. And we make these huge bets. And in that case, we lost. There's loads of different examples of this. I mentioned universal credit briefly earlier, and universal credit is quite a good example of a sort of a failure turned into a success. So in the first 3 years of universal credit, it was run exactly the way that I described with the NHS, very linear, very waterfall, trying to work out everything up front. And in its first 3 years, universal credit had just produced large piles of paper, spent €500 million, and nobody had used it. It was a bit of a disaster. And it was such a disaster that our parliament said to the government, this is absolutely not good enough. People could lose their job over this. Ministers would lose their job. And because it was such a crisis, universal credit pivoted. Big program, quite painful, but it pivoted to the ways of working that I described in the radical, the multidisciplinary teams, the test and learn. And lots of people went, well, you can't do these kinds of things because this is just kind of digital people. This is just innovation. You can't do these things to the biggest programs in government. But they could, and they did. And universal credit was reset using that kind of test and learn type approach, iterating the policy, the technology, and the delivery. And when COVID hit the UK, universal credit had been running as a service for maybe about 4 or 5 years since then. And it coped with a 12 times increase in demand pretty much overnight for those benefit payments and stayed standing. And not only that, not only could it cope with that volume of increased demand, because of COVID, the actual policy, when it kind of came to who got benefit payments or not, that was changing almost on a daily basis, certainly on a weekly basis. And that whole service stage was serving millions of people could change with it. It had the flexibility and the responsiveness to deal with that uncertainty. And that was because it had applied these ways of working rather than that linear waterfall path. Now, you'll be sitting there thinking about this and going, oh, you'll be thinking, well, this sounds great, but this is really hard in government. Nothing is actually set up to sort of support how I can work like this. And to some extent, you're right. This is incredibly difficult to do. And I mentioned right at the start, a lot of these ways of working are kind of playing out in exceptional circumstances, in times where government, for whatever reason, either because it's got an exceptional leader or it's dealing with a crisis, the rules of the game, the normal rules of the game, are suspended. And when I say the rules of the game, the sort of the ways that the bureaucracy works can make this kind of working, this test and learn approach quite difficult, are often comes down to some combination of these six things. The way that money gets handed out in government tends to be in big chunks. It tends to be as painful to ask for a huge amount of money over many, many years as it does to ask for a small amount of money more often. So what do? You ask for a large amount of money over many, many years. That tends to get in people's way. The same goes for procurement, bringing in suppliers. We've got a tendency in the UK to let very, very long-term contracts, again, trying to work out everything that those suppliers will do up front rather than be more responsive and reactive to how things might play out in reality. Communications, again, that sort of political tendency to announce the big pot of money that we're going to spend on the thing rather than what has actually been delivered week by week, month by month. Capability, quite often the skills to do some of these things, sort of some of those characters in the multidisciplinary teams that I was talking about in terms of things like service design and operational experience. Quite a lot of those skills are often not in-house within government. The underlying data and technology platforms that you build these services on often aren't quite in the right shape. And more fundamentally, accountability for sort of test and learn and these kinds of approaches, and particularly when they're kind of trying to solve problems that work across multiple departments. Who's responsible? Which minister? Does it actually kind of funnel back into one person? How do you reconcile that kind of need for kind of cross-governmental working with that desperation that tends to happen, which is we need just one person that we can point at and it's their responsibility. So all of these kind of elements make these ways of working difficult. And in some ways, the radicalism is not so much in the ways of working, which, as I say, have been done in lots of exceptional circumstances. The radicalism is taking a look at these things, some of the really quite boring and technical kind of bureaucratic structure of government, the things that shape the incentives for civil servants and ministers, looking at these and going, how do we reframe these such that these ways of working become more straightforward, become less full of friction? Now, I just want to finish by sort of running briefly through a bit of future fiction, I suppose, for how this might look in practice, trying to kind of make this feel a little bit more tangible with a real example. So again, I'm going to start with another sort of story of fairly embarrassing British failure, just to kind of warm us up. So again, about 10 years ago, we had a policy called the Green Deal. And the Green Deal was essentially a sort of an energy efficiency drive, an energy efficiency policy. British houses are notoriously leaky and inefficient. They don't retain heat very well. And the government at the time wanted to make a kind of policy whereby it incentivized people to do things like install solid wall insulation on their house or install forms of low carbon heat like heat pumps and things like that. And a lot of very, very smart people worked out some quite complex economic models which said, oh, well, this is fairly straightforward. We can kind of provide these things that have got a certain payback period and people, give enough people the money to kind of go out and pay for them. And that'll all work because that's all rational and economic and it'll be fine. And it didn't. Because although it made perfect sense to the technocrat, things like installing solid wall insulation, quite a pain, actually, quite difficult if you're going to do that as a householder. There's quite a lot of friction involved. Same with installing heat pumps. Same with actually building up a supply chain of having enough installers to do it. So there were lots of quite practical issues that the policy didn't actually untangle before it got launched. And they spent a lot of time working out the perfect way of working it out on paper. But the policy doesn't play out on paper, it plays out in reality. And the reality kind of fell to bits. So how would you maybe do this differently if you're applying the radical to that particular problem? Well, you'd sort of probably start with a clear political intent and a clear outcome, something like this. So let's go, rather than saying we're going to deliver a Green Deal, let's say something like we're going to upgrade 5 million homes in the UK. And we're going to do that so that families have cheaper energy bills permanently. So in there, you've got two things. You've got a measurable, tangible outcome, 5 million, something to hang your hat on, something that's quite clear and defined. But you've also got something that's sort of quite human, quite politically sellable. Something about cheaper energy bills is the kind of thing that voters will feel, voters will remember. Combining those two things is quite important, I think. There is a bit of the technocrat in there, but there's also a bit of the politician. And having those things as a sort of North Star for the team is quite valuable. So that's your political intent. What are you doing on day one? Well, the first thing you're doing on day one is bringing your team together. And the team has a lot of the qualities that I've already talked about. You've got multidisciplinary, so you're going to have people in there who understand service design. You've got people in there who understand policy and legislation. You've got an economist in there. You've probably even got someone in there who actually installs heat pumps. Someone useful who actually, puts these things in houses and understand what that process is really like. You've almost certainly got a mix of different departments in there. There'll be the energy department represented, there'll be the planning department in there. You might have a mix of some people from local levels of government as well as central, because there are different jurisdictions where these things apply. What you'll definitely have is actual operational experience, as I say, people who've been on the ground, seeing what this actually plays out in reality. They'll have political access, so they can move quickly. If they get blocked by the system, they can actually address some of those issues. And this is another quite key point. They'll be quite small. There won't be hundreds and hundreds of people doing this, at least to start with. It will be quite a small, tight, very empowered, very expert team. 10 to 15 people is more than enough to get started with. Universal credit, as I mentioned, when that got reset, the team that was brought in to reset it was about 15 people. The program that had been running for 3 years, not doing very much, was 1,500 people. You can start small. Very quickly, within a week or so, that team will know what the pain points are with their core idea, that core idea about how we're making those 5 million homes more energy efficient. What is stopping that from happening now? What is getting in the way? Why have we not really made any progress on that in the last 15 years? And the reason why that can happen so quickly is with a lot of these problems, as a rule, government has a pretty clear sense of what the problem is. It's got a reasonably good guess. It won't be absolutely spot on, of course, but it will have quite a good sense of what's going on. And there's absolutely no point in falling in love with the problem for months and months and months, trying to work this out exhaustively, which is often what happens. Get a good enough picture of what we think is probably going wrong and what's causing the friction, and let's go out and test it. So very quickly, the team knows that, has that sense of where the friction is. And so within a few weeks, they're then out testing their assumptions about what needs to change by actually going and installing some of these things in a few houses. Could be a tiny number of houses, could be 10. When universal credit was reset, they tested the new version of the service in a single postal code area in London, literally 100 houses. They changed the law so they could use that kind of new system with just 100 houses. Start very small, but actually do the thing. Even if it's a very thin slice of the full end-to-end, it's the genuine end-to-end experience. Quite an important point. This is quite subtle, but it's worth saying. So these experiments aren't quite the same as pilots. You'll often hear the idea, we'll do lots of pilots, and then we'll take what works and then scale it. The problem I have with pilots sometimes is that they try something on a very small scale, go, oh, that's worked, brilliant. Let's just do that everywhere now. And the problem with that kind of methodology is it doesn't actually test, it tests the assumptions around the core idea, but it doesn't test the assumptions about how you scale it. And often the things that get in the way of scaling are things that might be quite different from things that are making the core idea not truly work. So as the team is going, they're iterating their assumptions about everything. As I've said, they're looking at the policy, they're looking at the underlying tech, they're looking at the operations, and they're consistently making this thing work a little bit better each time based on what they learn and the data that they gather. So after about maybe 3 months, thereabouts, a small amount of installations have actually happened. So some houses have got some things in that they didn't have before. And the team has learned a huge amount about what's getting in the way. Some stuff that they definitely knew about before, but a whole bunch of issues that have only surfaced because they've gone about actually testing and learning it in reality that they wouldn't have spotted if they were just going through this on paper. In the meantime, and around the same time, they've also started to publish some data on where they've got to. They put together a dashboard that actually transparently shows the progress that they're making. And to be honest, at this stage, people are probably making fun of them because they've said, okay, we're going to install this stuff in 5 million homes. And at the moment, you've done 12. Who cares? But the point is that the communication is about delivery and about putting that transparency around the data so anyone can see that progress. The team is also talking about how it's going about things, communicating directly with the people that they're installing things with. Another point around comms. So I confess, I'm not sure what happened in Switzerland, but in the UK during COVID, you would have politicians come on the television basically every day or so. Certainly in the early days, it was pretty much every day, updating people on what was actually going on. And this was a fairly kind of radical departure from typical government comms. And I think it's quite an interesting model for kind of a new way of working. So in this case, every month or so, the minister who's responsible for this particular piece of work will come out, speak to the press and the public, and answer any questions about what's going on, referring to the data around delivery. And the point of this is sort of about breaking out of that cycle where the political communication engagement of a major program is at the start, we'll announce a huge amount of money for the thing, then we'll sort of forget about it for 3 years. And then at some point, we'll hopefully announce that the thing gets launched, and that's it. This is a much more kind of regular drumbeat of communication. Funnily enough, when we've sort of seen this in places where it's actually been done, politicians tend to really like this because rather than just show off at the start that they're putting lots of money in and then show off at the end when they kind of cut the ribbon and the thing is open, they get a sort of positive political moment every month if they want. They can go out and show off about how the number of homes has increased bit by bit and to sort of demonstrate that progress and momentum. So it's quite a different rhythm of communication. Maybe talking sort of 6 months, a year at this stage, the team will probably have proved that the core idea is robust. They can actually do this. They've got a sense that it is possible to kind of install these kinds of interventions in people's homes. But they haven't yet fully proved it can be scaled. So that's the kind of one fork in the road. It's like, okay, we think we've got something that's going to work here. Let's look at how we do this at scale. The alternative path is they'll go, actually, you know what, this just isn't working. We've tried this in lots of different places. We've tried different interventions. It's just not delivering on the outcome. And at that point, they could stop. And that's the difference between some of this and some of that kind of methodology I talked about in the NHS, whereby the cost of failure by working in this way is much lower. It's a much smaller team. They've spent a lot less money. They've stopped the thing a lot more quickly. Whereas in that more conventional kind of program construct, that will have gone on a lot longer and spent a lot more before that process has stopped. About a year in, you'll be starting to face different kinds of problems, the problems of scale rather than the problems of the core idea. And they might be related to things in the supply chain, actually literally getting a hold of enough fluff to put in people's roofs or finding enough people to install it. Or they might be dependencies on other bits of government in order for this to work. Different kinds of problems will be emerging. And again, the same methodology of test and learn will be applied to solve it. And in response to that, more teams will be added. So the team will start to scale at this stage from that initial core of 10 to 15. Now, it's quite important here that I've said add more teams, not add more people. So what tends to happen in big programs is lots more people will be thrown at them. And what more people tends to mean in government is more layers and more hierarchy, and generally everything getting a bit slower. The kind of approach taken to things like scaling universal credit was to add more multidisciplinary teams, the unit of delivery being a team rather than some people, and giving them a discrete problem to sort of solve so that they could all keep moving at relatively high pace rather than sort of getting squashed by a big program structure. But those teams still have the same characteristics around multidisciplinary, multi-organization as the first one. At this point, something will have gone wrong. It's bound to. There'll be a bit of abuse in the papers. That generally happens here. But again, the story will be, that's fine. We got something wrong. We'll go back. We'll test again. We'll pivot and move on, rather than the whole thing's a disaster. We need to stop. And after maybe 3-4 years or so, substantial progress will have been made towards delivering that overall outcome. And as the kind of rollout continues, the actual kind of core of what the team is trying to do will again pivot from just scaling the idea to how do we reach the hard to reach areas? How do we kind of finish off this, do the kind of really tricky bits at the end, which will often have another different set of problems and challenges to overcome. It's not a talk in 2024 if I don't mention AI at some point, and I've deliberately saved it to this stage of the game, because actually you could start with all of this and go, well, we can probably figure out and throw some technology or some artificial intelligence to solve this problem. But actually, it's this point in the process that's the best time to be thinking about that. Because at this stage in the process, the team will understand the service that they're delivering so well, they'll know exactly which of the bits of this that could be automated, which are the bits that don't involve a kind of human to human relationship or need that kind of genuine sense of connection for it to work. Because there will be some. There will be bits of this process that are like, oh, well, this is basically the same in 99.9% of cases. So let's automate it. Let's put in a chatbot. Let's use some AI. Let's do that now. But let's do it at that point when we fully understood what are the parts that could be automated in order to get greater efficiency, rather than start from the point of, let's try and use some AI to make this thing shorter. Because if you do that and you get that wrong, you actually end up creating a lot more friction and a lot more cost rather than the efficiency that you could get from those technologies. And finally, 4 or 5 years, the outcome is hopefully in reach. And those that are more observant will have noticed that the graphic has changed. It's in reach even though the minister has changed, because that happens too. And everything about this sort of program, this policy, is probably quite different to how it looked in the first 100 days. The team will have changed a lot. The policy will have changed a lot. The operations will have changed a lot. And still, even then, even though that the kind of is coming towards an end, the team is continuing to iterate and aiming for greater responsiveness, but also greater efficiency as it learns more about how to do this thing really, really well. So I'm going to finish just with a few kind of practical things, things that you can try in terms of trying to apply some of the principles of this methodology in your organization. So first is very simple and something that I imagine a lot of you have done already, but really work out who your users are, who are the kind of people who are actually using the public services that you are responsible for delivering. Go and talk to them, see what they say. They might be your friends or your family. They're probably using the public services. They'll tell you what they really think. But I think I kind of overemphasize how important that kind of closing of the gap between public servants and the public is in terms of getting really rich information for how you improve those services. Thinking in terms of services is the second point, and working out, okay, well, where are the points of friction? What is making this hard for people? Are those points of friction deliberate? Are they solved using quite kind of complicated things, or are they solved just by changing a few words on a web page? Sometimes there are some very simple solutions to some quite complex problems by looking at that kind of friction. The third is, if you can, try and build prototypes to test your theories. Try not to win the argument just on paper. Winning the argument on paper is really important, obviously, that's quite a core skill of government. But actually, if you can build the thing and put it in front of real people, it's much easier for them to give you a sense of how this is actually going to work or not. Rather than if you just tell people your idea, generally speaking, people will go, sounds like a great idea. But if you actually show them what it looks and feels like, they'll end up having quite a different conversation. And if you can, work in the open. Tell the story of how you go about doing this as you go with it. Because public servants around the world are wrestling with these very similar problems and very similar challenges. And there's a huge opportunity for that group to learn a lot from one another. We're not as special as we think across different countries. There's lots of shared learning to be got. So do tell your story as you go. Thank you very much for listening. I'll stop there and look forward to any questions.